In the opening years of the Second World War, long before the world understood how deeply espionage would shape its outcome, a quiet race unfolded in the shadows of Europe. It was a race not measured in territory gained or armies defeated, but in information stolen, forged, intercepted, or buried. Few outside the upper echelons of Allied command ever knew how close the balance of power came to tipping in those early months of 1940 and 1941, when British and American intelligence services began forging a secret partnership designed to undermine the Axis from within. At the time, MI6 operated as a seasoned yet strained intelligence organization fighting for survival, while across the Atlantic, the United States still found itself months away from the attack on Pearl Harbor and the subsequent declaration of war. Yet even then, a handful of American officers sensed what was coming, and they moved quietly, deliberately to prepare. The struggle began with the collapse of Western Europe. As German forces swept across the continent using blitzkrieg tactics, British intelligence scrambled to restructure its capabilities. The Special Operations Executive, created by Winston Churchill in July 1940 with the blunt instruction to set Europe ablaze, brought new urgency to sabotage and guerrilla warfare. MI6, meanwhile, faced the near-impossible challenge of rebuilding its networks after catastrophic losses in the Low Countries. American observers, stationed in London through the newly formed Coordinator of Information, the precursor to the OSS, watched in growing alarm. For them, the fall of France and the relentless bombing campaign of the Blitz were not foreign tragedies, they were warnings of the future. One of these American officers, Colonel William Wild Bill Donovan, toured the ruins of London in the fall of 1940 and later wrote in his journal, "This is not their war alone. The shadows of this conflict already reach our coast." His report to President Roosevelt became one of the foundational documents that shaped U.S. entry into intelligence operations. But cooperation did not come easily. The British, protective of their secrets, shared only fragments. The Americans, lacking experience, struggled to understand the complexities of European espionage. Still, necessity forced the two nations together. Insight came from the small victories, intercepts from Bletchley Park, coded reports smuggled out of occupied Paris, and whispered rumors of German atom research emerging from refugee scientists. Yet these fragments painted an incomplete picture. Across the continent, German intelligence, the Abwehr, tightened its grip, arresting suspected resistance fighters and infiltrating Allied networks. The risk of betrayal grew daily. British case officers reported agents disappearing in Belgium and the Netherlands, vanished without a trace after sending final coded signals. For every operative who returned with valuable intelligence, another simply went silent. The reveal, when it came, was subtle. Allied analysts noticed discrepancies between the number of couriers deployed and the number returning. Some missions, recorded only in handwritten logs or marginal notes in SOE files, never appeared in official reports. Entire codenames vanished from later archives as though erased intentionally. Whether these omissions were bureaucratic failures or deliberate acts to conceal compromised networks, historians still debate. What remains clear is that the early intelligence war was far more chaotic and uncertain than official histories once admitted. This hidden struggle yields a modern lesson. Intelligence victories often depend less on grand operations and more on the persistent gathering of small, imperfect clues. The early Anglo-American collaboration was built not on sweeping successes but on resilience, on choosing to continue even when the cost seemed unbearable. And it was in these darkest moments that the foundations for the most daring classified operations of the war were laid. As 1941 drew to a close, the world changed overnight. The attack on Pearl Harbor thrust the United States fully into the conflict, and cooperation between the two nations accelerated at breathtaking speed. The OSS and MI6 began trading not only tactics but personnel, embedding American officers inside British units and dispatching British instructors to train new American recruits in covert warfare. Out of this alliance emerged a new approach: deception, sabotage, infiltration, and operations so sensitive that their files would remain sealed for decades. Yet even as their partnership deepened, unanswered questions lingered. What happened to the early agents who vanished behind enemy lines? Why do certain missions appear only in fragments, buried in restricted archives? And why did some intelligence officers insist, years later, that critical decisions were made based on information from sources no longer identifiable? These mysteries formed the backdrop for what would soon become the most audacious Allied deception of the war, Operation Mincemeat. It would mark the first time British and American intelligence truly tested their combined capabilities. But it would also raise new questions, questions that historians still scrutinize today, as classified files slowly came to light. History remembers Operation Mincemeat as one of the most successful deception missions of the Second World War, a masterstroke that misled German high command about the location of the Allied invasion in 1943. But fewer people know how precarious, improvised, and deeply mysterious its origins truly were. The story did not begin in a strategy room, but in an obscure corner of British intelligence known as Section 17M, a small department within naval intelligence tasked with creating plausible forgeries. What began as a theoretical proposal in a 1939 memo soon evolved into a plan so audacious that even its architects questioned whether it could possibly work. The struggle facing Allied planners at the start of 1943 was severe. With North Africa nearly secured, the natural next step for the Allies was an invasion of southern Europe. Germany expected this, anticipating landings in Sardinia, Corsica, or Greece. To achieve surprise, the Allies needed the Germans to believe that their main target would be Greece, drawing their reserves away from the actual objective, Sicily. Yet German analysts were remarkably skeptical of Allied disinformation, having exposed several false trails already. The British needed something beyond clever radio chatter or forged maps. They needed the enemy to believe unquestioningly in a physical, undeniable source. Enter the unusual idea first outlined by British intelligence officer Charles Fraser Smith and refined by Naval Intelligence Section Officer Ewan Montague. A body carrying falsified documents, planted where Axis officials would inevitably find it. But for a plan that required impeccable authenticity, the challenges were immense. A corpse could not simply be found. It needed a plausible identity, a convincing backstory, personal effects, and documents that appeared real to even the most suspicious WWII investigator. Every detail, from the wear on the man's clothing to the ink used on his letters, needed to withstand microscopic scrutiny. Historical insight into these preparations comes from Montague's wartime notes, portions of which remained classified for decades. In one margin he wrote, "The smallest inconsistency could cost thousands of lives. Every scratch on a photograph, every cigarette stub in his pocket, we must think of all things a dead man might carry, and all the things he would never carry." The meticulousness bordered on obsession. MI5's counterintelligence unit created a full civilian identity, Major William Martin, Royal Marines. His wallet was filled with real cinema ticket stubs, personal letters, an overdraft notice from his bank, and the photograph of a fictional fiancée. None of these items were arbitrary. Each had to look naturally lived in. And yet, the reveal, often overlooked, lies in the uncertainty surrounding the corpse's provenance. The official story states that the body belonged to Gondwr Michael, a homeless Welshman who died after ingesting rat poison. But files declassified in the early 2000s revealed inconsistencies. Michael's cause of death differed across internal memos, and several medical officers questioned whether the state of the body truly matched the official account. Some historians suggest that additional, now-lost layers of secrecy surrounded the corpse's preparation. Whether out of respect for the deceased or because certain procedures were too sensitive to record, parts of this process remain obscured. When the body was released off the coast of Huelva, Spain, on April 30, 1943, the operation entered its most unpredictable phase. Britain relied on the assumption that pro-German Spanish officials would share the documents with WWII agents. But that outcome was never guaranteed. For nearly 2 weeks, Allied intelligence officers waited anxiously for word. Signals intercepts eventually confirmed that the Germans had accepted the contents of the briefcase as genuine. Hitler himself was convinced, ordering reinforcements to Greece and the Balkans, troops that might otherwise have been positioned to defend Sicily. The application of mincemeat's lessons echoed long after the war. Modern deception operations still study its principles, create stories too mundane to be doubted, ensure every detail reinforces the central lie, and allow the enemy to discover the information rather than forcing it upon them. The mission demonstrated that intelligence victories depend not merely on secret facts, but on shaping the beliefs of decision-makers. Yet the operation's historical footprint remains marked by mystery. Several officers involved in the mission later noted unexplained gaps in early planning documents. A courier in charge of transporting personal effects for Major Martin recorded in his logbook that items were received from external source, details withheld. Even Montague acknowledged that not all contributors were credited and that some files were removed from the official archive in the late 1940s. As mincemeat officially closed, its success emboldened the Allied intelligence community, proving that deception could save thousands of lives and shape the course of campaigns. But its lingering questions, particularly about the body at the heart of the mission, cast long shadows. And if this operation held secrets that endured for decades, one cannot help but wonder. What about the teams who did not return, the agents whose missions remained unspoken? That question leads us directly into the next chapter. The fate of the Jedburgh teams parachuted into occupied France, some of whom disappeared without a trace. By 1944, with the Allied invasion of Western Europe imminent, a new breed of covert operative prepared to strike behind enemy lines. They were known as the Jedburgh teams, small, three-man units composed of one American, one British and one French officer, each trained in sabotage, radio coordination and guerrilla warfare. Their mission: parachute into occupied France ahead of or alongside the advancing Allied armies, organize local resistance fighters, and disrupt German supply lines with pinpoint strikes. Though their operations became legendary after the war, a lesser-known truth shadows their legacy. Several teams simply vanished after insertion, leaving behind only fragments of radio signals, incomplete field notes and unanswered questions. The struggle facing the Allies in early 1944 was twofold. First, they needed reliable intelligence about German troop movements deep inside France, information crucial for the success of Operation Overlord. Second, they needed to ensure the French resistance could coordinate effectively once the invasion began. British SOE and the American OSS knew that scattered resistance groups, from Gola cells to communist networks, lacked cohesion. The Jedburgh concept aimed to fix that. But operational conditions were brutal. German security forces, including the Gestapo, the Sicherheitsdienst (SD), and specialized anti-paratrooper units, were hunting for radio operators relentlessly. Every transmission risked detection. A vivid insight into Jedburgh training comes from the diary of OSS officer Lieutenant Thomas "Tommy" Bohrer, who later served on Team James. In a June 1944 entry he wrote, "We train for 6 hours on weapons, 6 on demolitions, then run night maneuvers until dawn. The instructors remind us daily, if you hesitate, the locals die. If you trust the wrong man, you die." They practiced parachuting at RAF Ringway, demolitions at Beaulieu, and coded transmissions in cramped training huts. Many Jedburghs were barely in their 20s, yet entrusted with tasks that could shift the momentum of entire divisions. The reveal begins on the night of June 9, 1944, when the first teams dropped into France. Team Hugh, consisting of British Captain John Grimson, American Lieutenant Charles "Buck" Gleason and French officer André Maugin, parachuted into the Limousin region. Their mission was to coordinate with the Maquis du Limousin to sabotage German communications. They succeeded brilliantly for several weeks, blowing the same railway line 6 times in 10 days. But other teams were not so fortunate. Team Orchid, inserted near the Morvan Forest, transmitted a short coded message on June 13, landing rough, hostile presence, moving north. That was the last confirmed contact. German records captured after the war describe anti-paratrooper sweeps in the region but never mentioned 3 foreign operatives. Local testimonies offer conflicting accounts. Some villagers recalled seeing 3 parachutes drifting off course into a fog-covered ravine. Others claimed the men were betrayed by a collaborator. Yet no bodies were ever recovered. Their disappearance remains one of the enduring enigmas of Allied clandestine history. Another missing group, Team Willow, parachuted into Brittany in July 1944. They were tasked with coordinating ambushes to delay the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich from reaching Normandy. Their radio operator, Sergeant Paul Langley, sent 2 successful transmissions before abruptly falling silent. OSS files, declassified decades later, show that German direction-finding trucks operated heavily in the area. But here too the trail goes cold. A 1946 report by the French Ministry of Veterans Affairs notes only, status, unlocated, presumed captured or killed. No confirmation. Even in the era of exhaustive wartime record-keeping, these gaps are remarkable. Modern historians often revisit these disappearances with caution. Some suggest that incomplete documentation and chaotic field conditions explain the gaps. Others believe that certain Jedburgh missions may have involved additional objectives considered too sensitive to preserve in official archives. The abnormal scarcity of paperwork for these missing teams, compared with the extensive files of surviving units, raises questions that remain unresolved. The application of the Jedburgh methodology echoes today in modern special forces doctrine. The concept of small, self-sufficient units working with local resistance forces heavily influenced U.S. Army Special Forces, founded in 1952. The Green Berets, as they would later be known, carry much of the Jedburgh operational DNA: cultural fluency, deep insertion, mission autonomy, and unconventional warfare tactics. Yet even with their strategic successes, the Jedburgh story never escapes its shadow of uncertainty. Families of the missing operatives petitioned for information well into the 1970s. Some investigators quietly hinted that the truth might lie in classified files concerning resistance collaborators, double agents, or sensitive post-war political concerns. Whatever the real explanations, the silence surrounding these missions remains striking. As the Allies pushed deeper into occupied territories, the Jedburgh operations paved the way for a new era of behind-the-lines warfare. But they also foreshadowed the fragility and danger of covert missions, where a single betrayal or misstep could erase an entire team from history. Their fates form the threshold to our next story, Operation Postmaster, a covert naval raid so delicate and so diplomatically explosive that Britain denied its existence for years afterward. Long before Allied armies stormed the beaches of Normandy, an obscure and classified raid unfolded thousands of miles away, on a small Spanish island off the coast of West Africa. It would become one of the most delicate covert operations of the entire war, one so politically explosive that Britain denied involvement for years. Known as Operation Postmaster, the mission targeted 3 Axis-controlled vessels anchored in the neutral harbor of Santa Isabel on the island of Fernando Po, modern-day Bioko, Equatorial Guinea. For a mission carried out by barely a dozen men in a single night, its stakes were enormous. A single misstep could have ignited a diplomatic crisis capable of dragging Spain fully into the war on the Axis side. The struggle at the heart of Postmaster began in 1941, when British intelligence grew increasingly concerned about German and Italian ships stationed in neutral ports across West Africa. These vessels, some disguised as merchant freighters, others acting as radio relay stations, played a quiet but crucial role in supporting the Axis U-boat campaign. From hidden compartments, they transmitted convoy movements, weather reports, and coded signals that allowed U-boats to stalk Allied merchant shipping. Fernando Po's harbor hosted 3 such vessels: the Italian merchant ship Duchessa d'Aosta and 2 German tugboats, Lacamba and Bibundi. All were protected by Spain's careful neutrality. The challenge for British planners was straightforward but perilous. Neutral territory could not be attacked openly. Diplomatic channels had yielded nothing. The Spanish colonial governor refused to act against Axis ships. So, the Special Operations Executive, SOE, in coordination with the Naval Intelligence Division, developed a bold plan. They would steal the vessels outright, under cover of night, without leaving any trace of British involvement. It required stealth, deception, and extraordinary precision. The operation's most vivid insights come from the diary of Major Gus March Phillips, commander of the Small-Scale Raiding Force, SSRF. In an entry dated December 1941 he wrote, "The fewer who know, the better. Even within our own circles questions are dangerous. We go in shadows and we leave without footprints." His team trained in clandestine boarding tactics off the coast of Scotland, practicing silent approaches, the cutting of anchor cables and coordinated nighttime navigation. For secrecy, they operated from a civilian manned tug, the Vulcan, chartered in Lagos under the guise of a shipping company's supply run. The reveal began on the evening of January 14, 1942, when March Phillips and his small raiding party approached Santa Isabel under the cover of moonless darkness. Disguised as laborers making a routine supply delivery, they maneuvered their small craft toward the anchored Axis ships. The harbor was eerily quiet, broken only by the sound of water brushing against the hulls. Timing was critical. Spanish guards patrolled periodically, and a single shout could unravel the mission. With remarkable speed, the raiders boarded the Duchessa d'Aosta, subdued the few crew members on deck, and severed the anchor chains. The vessel began to drift silently as the raiders signaled for the Vulcan to apply towing power. At nearly the same moment, other raiders secured the German tugs. Within minutes, all 3 ships were moving together out of the harbor like ghost vessels, carried by tide and torque into the darkness. Yet, hidden within the success of Postmaster is a layer of mystery that still invites speculation. Several SOE communication logs from early January 1942 contain notations about external advisories and unofficial intelligence sources guiding the timing of the operation. Some historians believe these phrases refer to covert informants within Santa Isabel, possibly even sympathetic Spanish officials, whose identities were never recorded. Others suggest the British may have intercepted more German communications in the area than publicly acknowledged, information that remains classified or lost. Another unresolved detail concerns the cargo aboard the Duchessa d'Aosta. Officially, the ship carried miscellaneous goods. but declassified files from the 1970s mention sealed crates of unknown origin discovered in the hold once the vessel reached Lagos. The contents of these crates are not described in surviving records. The omission has sparked ongoing debate among researchers, who wonder whether the cargo included encryption materials or sensitive intelligence equipment that the British chose not to reveal publicly. The application of Postmaster's lessons extends far beyond naval warfare. Modern covert operations still rely heavily on the principles demonstrated here: deniability, precision, and the exploitation of gaps in international law. The raid remains a classic example of how special operations can influence global strategy without firing a single shot. Despite the mission's success, Britain's reaction was one of complete silence. The Foreign Office denied involvement. Spanish officials protested but lacked evidence. And for years, even SOE veterans were instructed not to speak of what had occurred in that quiet harbor on a January night. Fernando Pa became a footnote, a place where ships vanished and no one in power offered an explanation. As Europe entered 1943 and 1944, the number of Allied clandestine operations grew exponentially. Yet Postmaster's shadows lingered, a reminder that even victories could leave behind unanswered questions and sealed files. And as the war intensified, a new and far larger operation emerged, the airborne supply network known as Carpetbagger, where entire crews vanished into the night skies over occupied Europe with missions that remain partly unexplained to this day. By late 1943, the night skies over Europe were no longer merely the domain of bombers and fighters. They had become passageways for one of the most secretive aerial operations of the entire war, an effort the public knew little about then and still only partially understands today. It was called Operation Carpetbagger, a joint U.S. British mission designed to infiltrate agents, weapons, and supplies deep behind German lines to fuel resistance movements across Nazi-occupied Europe. These missions were flown in near-complete darkness, with no navigation lights, minimal radio use, and flight paths that often skirted German searchlights by mere meters. Even among special operations, Carpetbagger stood apart. Its crews were told bluntly, "You fly alone. If you go down, no one will search for you." The struggle that drove the operation forward was rooted in necessity. By 1943, sabotage efforts across France, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Belgium were increasing in scale, but they suffered from one critical shortage: supplies. Resistance fighters often lacked weapons, explosives, medical kits, radios, even proper boots. The Jedburgh operations and SOE networks on the ground could only be effective if they received steady support from the air. To meet the need, the U.S. Army Air Forces formed the 801st Bombardment Group, provisional, later redesignated the 492nd Bombardment Group. Operating from Harrington Airfield in Northamptonshire, they flew heavily modified B-24 Liberators stripped of armor, painted matte black, and fitted with chutes and hatches designed specifically for nighttime drops. Insights into the daily reality of Carpetbagger missions come from the logbook of Captain Robert R. Bob Weller, a veteran B-24 pilot. In one entry dated April 1944, he wrote, "No moon. Cloud cover thick. Town lights blacked out. Only the dark shapes of forests beneath us. We descend to 500 feet, lower in some valleys. We drop on the mark, a single flashlight blinking from a field. Then we pull away before the flak wakes up." Weller and crews like his navigated by dead reckoning, star charts, and improvised marks carved into cockpit frames. A miscalculation of even a few seconds could mean missing a drop zone, or worse, hitting the wrong one and exposing a resistance cell. The reveal begins with the dangers that haunted the mission from the moment aircraft lifted off the runway. German night fighter units prowled the skies. Radar-guided flak batteries grew more accurate with each passing month. Thick fog over the channel turned routine flights into disorienting ordeals. And unlike bomber formations that could rely on mutual protection, Carpetbagger aircraft flew individually, often without radio communication. As the operation expanded, so did the losses. Among the most mysterious cases was the disappearance of B-24 No. 42 to 50,291, known informally among the crews as the Phantom Bell. On the night of July 4, 1944, the aircraft departed Harrington on a mission to deliver supplies near Châteauroux in central France. Its final radio acknowledgement came shortly after crossing the French coast. German reports make no mention of a crash, no signals were picked up, and no wreckage was ever found. Post-war searches in the Loire Valley yielded nothing. The mission log simply lists the crew as missing, no trace. Today, the Phantom Bell remains one of Carpetbagger's most enduring mysteries. Another unresolved loss involved AB-24 designated for a Dutch resistance drop in September 1944. The aircraft signaled arrival near the intended drop zone outside Apeldoorn but then abruptly ceased contact. Eyewitness accounts collected after the war conflict sharply. Some locals recalled hearing an engine sputtering low over the forest, while others insisted no aircraft passed overhead at all. Even more puzzling, German night fighter logs show no interception attempts in the area that night. The U.S. Army Air Force's investigation, completed in 1947, concluded only, cause unknown, likely navigational failure or unrecorded enemy action. But historians have noted the curious absence of German radar logs for that region on that particular night, a gap that still lacks explanation. The application of carpetbaggers' tactics shaped modern covert air operations. Today's special forces, whether inserting teams, delivering humanitarian supplies in denied territory, or executing precision low-visibility missions, still study the techniques pioneered at Harrington. Ultra-low flight profiles, terrain masking, clandestine navigation, and minimal electronic signatures. Carpetbagger crews learned these techniques through trial, error, and sometimes fatal consequences. Emotionally, the operation left deep marks on those who survived. Many pilots spoke decades later about the eerie silence of their missions, the isolation of flying into occupied territory with only the hum of engines for company. Others recalled the brief flashes of connection, a single lantern in a field, a coded Morse signal from the ground, or the silhouette of resistance fighters racing to recover the dropped containers before German patrols arrived. These moments reminded them that their deadly missions had a human purpose. Yet Carpetbagger remains incomplete in terms of documentation. Some mission files were destroyed by accident in the immediate post-war years. Others were intentionally sealed for national security reasons. Even today, historians note that several missing aircraft cases have only partial records, suggesting that unknown factors may have influenced their fate, whether related to intelligence compromises, mechanical failures, or encounters that never made it into official German or Allied logs. As Allied air operations intensified in early 1945, the skies grew even more dangerous. Carpetbagger crews continued flying until resistance support was no longer needed. But the war's final months introduced a new race, one not fought with bombs or bullets, but with intelligence. The Allies suspected Germany was pursuing advanced scientific research, including nuclear development. And to uncover the truth, they launched a different kind of covert mission, one that would lead to laboratories, hidden facilities, and scientists who sometimes vanished only hours before Allied forces arrived. The next operation, Alsos, would bring together intelligence officers, soldiers, and scientists in a desperate hunt for information that could reshape the balance of global power. By 1944, as Allied armies pushed toward Germany's borders, a new and chilling question dominated the minds of intelligence officers. How close was Hitler to developing an atomic weapon? 4 years, scattered reports from refugee scientists, intercepted communications, and fragmentary intelligence hinted that the Third Reich might possess a secret research program, one capable of producing a bomb with unimaginable destructive power. To uncover the truth, the Allies launched a covert mission unlike any other in the war. It had a simple yet daunting objective: locate Germany's nuclear research, capture its scientists, seize its materials, and prevent any of it from falling into enemy or even Allied hands. This operation, codenamed Alsos, would take place on battlefields, in laboratories, and in towns where the war's final days produced more questions than answers. The struggle began with uncertainty. In late 1943, physicist Samuel Goudsmit, a Dutch-American scientist who had fled occupied Europe, briefed the U.S. Office of Scientific Research and Development on the potential scale of German atomic research. Goudsmit feared that German physicists, many of them world-renowned, might be years ahead of the Allies. General Leslie Groves, already overseeing the Manhattan Project, took these fears seriously. At his direction, Alsos teams were formed within the Manhattan Engineer District, staffed by intelligence officers, counterintelligence experts, and scientists capable of recognizing nuclear materials on site. Their challenge was not just technical, it was a race against time. As Allied forces advanced, German scientists were fleeing, documents were disappearing, and laboratories were being hurriedly dismantled or evacuated. Insight into the growing tension comes from the wartime notes of Lieutenant Colonel Boris Pash, Alsos field commander. In an entry dated November 1944, written during operations in Strasbourg, he noted, "We arrived too late. Rumors say that trucks came in the night. Where they went, no one says. Locals claim equipment was burned. I suspect more is buried than destroyed." His words reflected a persistent theme throughout the operation, the unsettling sense that German nuclear research was constantly one step ahead of Allied tracking efforts. The reveal began in earnest during Alsos missions across France and Belgium, where the team located German scientists like Hans von Halban and Otto Hahn. But the most dramatic turning point came after the capture of Strasbourg in November 1944. There, in the basement of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute's annex, Alsos investigators found evidence of experiments related to uranium and heavy water. Yet crucial components were missing, removed only days earlier. Allied reports indicate that German personnel evacuated the site via unmarked vehicles heading east. Their destination was unknown, though speculation centered around facilities in southern Germany. As Alsos pushed closer to the German heartland in early 1945, the mission took on a new urgency. If Soviet forces reached key scientific sites first, the geopolitical consequences would be profound. Thus, Operation Alsos expanded into a sweeping hunt that often moved ahead of regular military units. Teams scoured laboratories in Heidelberg, mines in the Harz Mountains, and hidden workshops scattered across Württemberg. Some sites were found intact. Others were stripped bare, with charred fragments of documents hinting at the knowledge that once lay there. One of the operation's most mysterious episodes occurred during the race to secure the Hagerloch research reactor in April 1945. While Alsos teams successfully captured the small experimental reactor, uranium cubes, and components of the nuclear apparatus, several early field reports describe additional containers removed from the site before arrival. These containers, allegedly transported by unknown personnel, were never recovered. Whether they held sensitive research, classified correspondence, or simply irrelevant equipment remains a topic of debate among historians. What is certain is that gaps in the German chain of custody preceded the Alsos team's arrival, raising questions that have never been fully resolved. Another layer of intrigue surrounds the scientists themselves. While most were taken into custody under Operation Epsilon and housed at Farm Hall in England after the war, Alsos field notes reference at least 3 individuals who were reportedly present at research sites in February and March 1945 but were unaccounted for by the time Alsos investigators arrived. Their names, redacted in surviving documents, appear only once in early intercept summaries. Later records omit them entirely. Whether these individuals escaped, were killed, or were quietly detained outside official channels remains unknown. The application of Alsos's lessons resonates today in modern counterproliferation missions. The operation underscored the importance of rapid, science-driven intelligence gathering during wartime and the need to prevent advanced research from falling into hostile hands. The legacy of Alsos lies not only in its findings, but in its methods still studied by intelligence agencies tasked with monitoring nuclear programs worldwide. Yet Alsos remains a mission shrouded in secrecy. Even decades after the war, declassified files show gaps, inconsistencies, and references to missing materials. Goudsmit himself reflected later, "We learned much, but not everything. Some paths we traced ended in darkness." His words capture the lingering uncertainty that surrounds parts of Germany's wartime research. As the operation closed and the war in Europe drew to an end, Alsos had achieved its primary objective. Germany did not possess a functional nuclear weapon. But the unanswered questions, missing documents, unidentified individuals, and vanished equipment remind us that even in victory, intelligence work rarely reveals the full story. And as we step back to view all 5 classified operations together, from Mincemeat's deception to the vanished Jedburgh teams, from the shadowy raid at Fernando Put to the aircraft lost in the night skies, one truth becomes clear. World War II was fought not only on battlefields, but in silence, darkness, and secrecy. Many of its mysteries remain just beyond reach, still waiting to be uncovered.